The vast emptiness of space stretched beyond the curved transparent dome of Nia 3 Academy, a solitary outpost of civilization on the frontier world that orbited a distant star at the edge of explored space. Thousands of stars punctured the violet darkness there, light traveling across unfathomable distances only to illuminate the solitary figure of Alicent as she stood motionless by the panoramic window, her azure skin absorbed and reflected the cold starlight, giving her an almost ethereal glow against the sterile academy walls. No other student or instructor ventured near her, partly out of respect for her evident desire for solitude, partly out of the instinctive caution that humans exhibited around Nianians. The species had a reputation for emotional detachment and physical prowess that made most humans uncomfortable, a discomfort that manifested as avoidance rather than open hostility. Each morning for the past 3 years, Alicent had performed the same ritual, watching the stars fade as Nia 3's primary sun crested the distant mountain range, feeling the subtle vibration through the floor as the Academy's environmental systems transition from night to day cycle. During these solitary moments, she allowed herself to experience what her Neonian training identified as unproductive nostalgia, remembering the amber skies of her home world and the complex harmonics of her native language that no translation system could adequately reproduce. These moments of remembered connection only emphasized her current isolation, a condition she had accepted as the inevitable consequence of her chosen career path in xenobiological research. Alicent had grown accustomed to this invisible barrier. 3 standard years on this research outpost had taught her that isolation was preferable to the awkward interactions that inevitably followed any attempt at integration. The human stared too much, asked intrusive questions about Nenian physiology, or worse, spoke slowly and loudly as though her grasp of standard language was somehow deficient despite her perfect command of 7 Earth languages and 4 non-terrestrial communication systems. The other non-human species were marginally better, but most maintained their distance, locked within their own cultural understandings and prejudices. So she maintained her distance, fulfilled her research obligations, and counted the days until her assignment ended and she could return to the ordered, logical society of Nenia, where emotional displays were contained within appropriate contexts and interpersonal boundaries were respected without question. Today, however, marked a disruption in her carefully ordered existence. The incoming Earth shuttle breached NE3's upper atmosphere, leaving a trail of superheated particles that dissipated against the magnetosphere. Alicent tracked its descent with violet eyes that missed nothing, noting the slight oscillation in its trajectory that suggested either suboptimal piloting or minor thruster malfunction. New arrivals meant new disruptions, new humans invading the spaces she had claimed as her own through silent habitation. The last group had taken nearly 3 months to learn to avoid her research areas during her preferred working hours. Now the adjustment period would begin again, with all the inefficiency that entailed. Inside the shuttle, Dwight Matthews clutched his worn travel bag tighter, knuckles whitening as the craft shuddered through the final descent. Unlike the other human students who chatted nervously or stared at their devices, he gazed out of the small port, hole drinking in his first glimpse of an alien world with undisguised wonder. The Academy's dome gleamed like a giant soap bubble, fragile yet resilient, against the harsh environment that sensors indicated would kill an unprotected human within minutes. The violet sky, so unlike Earth's familiar blue, made everything seem simultaneously alien and magical. The landscape below was a study in contrast. Jagged rock formations thrust upward from violet plains that undulated toward distant mountain ranges shrouded in perpetual clouds. It was beautiful in its stark hostility, a reminder that humans remain visitors here, tolerated by the planet only within the artificial environment of the Academy dome. Dwight had dreamed of this moment since childhood, when he had first watched documentary footage of the pioneering xenobiologist establishing contact with non-terrestrial species, while other children had fantasized about becoming space pilots or explorers. He had been captivated by the scientists who bridge biological divides, finding common ground between radically different evolutionary paths. His path to NIA-3 had required 15 years of specialized education, 3 separate advanced degrees, and thousands of hours of laboratory research, each step driven by the conviction that understanding alien life was the key to humanity's future. Now, as the shuttle entered final approach, he felt a curious mixture of professional achievement and personal trepidation. His academic knowledge was extensive, but he knew that theoretical understanding rarely survived first contact with reality unchanged. First off-world assignment? Asked the woman seated beside him, her voice betraying the casual confidence of someone who had made this journey before. She had introduced herself during the orbital approach, but tension had momentarily erased her name from his memory. Is it that obvious? Dwight smiled, running a hand through his dark hair that still carried the regulation cut from his time at Earth's Interplanetary Studies Institute. The precision of the cut had begun to soften during the 3-week journey from Earth, much like his preconceptions about what awaited him on Neo-3. You're the only one looking out. Instead of checking messages or emergency protocols, she replied, I'm Dr. Helena Ariadne, Psychology Division. This is my second frontier posting. First was on Europa, Jupiter's moon, though that barely counts as off-world these days with the colonization efforts. Dwight Matthews, Environmental Adaptation Research, First Frontier posting, first time off Earth. He extended his hand, which he shook firmly. Though I spent 6 months in the Mars simulation dome during training. Mars prep is good, but nothing really prepares you for the real frontier. Helena's expression grew more serious. The isolation gets to some people. The Academy might house over 300 researchers and staff, but after a few months it can feel like the smallest place in the universe. I applied specifically because of the isolation, Dwight admitted, after growing up in Greater Mumbai with 30 million neighbors. Some quiet seemed appealing. Helena laughed, a warm sound that drew glances from other passengers. You might get more than you bargain for. The real adventure begins after landing, she said, her expressions softening with something that might have been nostalgia or warning. The Academy looks orderly from out here, but inside it's a complex ecosystem of personalities, species, and competing research priorities. The science is only half the challenge. Navigating the social dynamics across species barriers. That's where things get interesting. Any advice for a newcomer? Dwight asked, grateful for any insight that might ease his transition into academy life. Helena considered the question thoughtfully. Remember that every species has its own cultural lens. What looks like rudeness or aggression might be a normal greeting protocol. What seems like friendship might be a dominance display. The universal translator handles language, but cultural context is something you have to learn through experience. She paused, then added with a wry smile, and whatever you do, never touch a Centurion's respiratory filters. They consider it equivalent to someone shoving a finger down your throat. Warning chimes sounded through the cabin, signaling the final approach. Dwight secured his harness, feeling the shuttle's deceleration as it aligned with the landing pad. The vessel shuddered, compensating for NEA 3 cross winds that could reach speeds of 200 km per hour during seasonal transitions. As the shuttle aligned with the landing pad, Dwight caught sight of a figure standing alone at one of the upper windows of the academy, a slender silhouette with skin the color of Earth's summer sky. Even from a distance, there was something compelling about her solitary vigil, something that spoke of both strength and isolation. Her stillness amidst the bustle of preparation for new arrivals created a striking contrast that drew his attention more effectively than any movement could have. Their eyes met across the divide of space, atmosphere, and species. For a brief moment it felt as though two worlds collided in that single glance. Earth and NEA 3, human and alien, warm flesh and cool blue skin. Dwight felt an inexplicable connection, a recognition that transcended the obvious physical differences. Ellison's was the first to break that connection. She turned away, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridor as she retreated deeper into the academy. Something inside her had responded to that human gaze in a way she found unsettling, a ripple across the still surface of her emotional control that she would need to examine and resolve through meditation before it affected her research efficiency. The human's eyes had contained something unexpected, an absence of the usual weariness she encountered from his species, replaced instead with genuine curiosity and something more complex that her Neonian cultural framework lacked precise terminology to describe. The experience left her with an unfamiliar sensation of anticipation, as though this particular human might represent something different from the predictable patterns of previous interactions. Such speculation was unproductive, she reminded herself firmly. Statistical probability suggested this encounter would follow the same trajectory as all others. Initial fascination with her alien nature, followed by confusion at her communication patterns, culminating in mutual avoidance. There was no logical reason to anticipate any deviation from this established sequence. The arrival hall buzzed with activity and the lingering scent of spacecraft fuel that the air filtration systems had yet to fully process. Human students clutched their belongings, blinking under the unfamiliar light spectrum that made everything appear slightly off color. Some already showed signs of the mild disorientation that came with adapting to NE3's gravity, approximately 0.92 of Earth standard. Medical staff circulated through the Crowd offering stabilization patches. For those experiencing more severe adjustment symptoms, Helena moved through the crowd with practiced deficiency, her tablet displaying the roster of names and assignments. She had been tasked with initial psychological assessment of the new arrivals, identifying any immediate adaptation concerns before they developed into more significant issues. That was a Nyan. Correct, Dwight asked, nodding toward the corridor where Ellison's had disappeared. He had studied the common, non-human species during his training, but seeing a Nanian in person was different from the holographic representations used in cultural sensitivity sessions. Helena followed his gaze, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. Yes, one of only 3 stationed at this academy. Ellis's Navivoran Xenobiological Research Division, brilliant mind from what I understand, but typical Nyan. Temperament meaning distant, self-contained. Nyanians evolved on a resource-scarce world with extreme environmental pressures. Their social structures developed around conservation rather than cooperation. Why share limited resources when doing so might threaten your survival? They find our human tendency toward constant communication and emotional expression inefficient. Helena tapped something on her tablet, adjusting his assignment parameters. You're assigned a Sector 4 Research Lab Epsilon. Coincidentally, that's adjacent to Ellison's primary workspace. Convenient, Dwight remarked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The assignment seemed fortuitous, offering an opportunity to observe Nanian research methods firsthand. His academic focus on environmental adaptation included cross-species approaches to hostile environments, and Nyans were renowned for their advanced adaptation techniques. For whom? Helena raised an eyebrow, catching his tone. Word of advice, Matthews, start with your human colleagues. The Neonian researchers aren't known for mentoring newcomers. Last Earth student who tried spent 3 months being completely ignored before requesting transfer to another division. Challenge accepted, Dwight murmured, more to himself than to Helena. The arrival hall continued filling as more new personnel disembarked from the shuttle. Technical staff moved among them, distributing equipment, access credentials, and orientation materials. The controlled chaos resembled any major Earth university on student arrival day, with the significant difference that most of these students held multiple advanced degrees and had competed against thousands of applicants for their positions at the academy. Among the crowd, Dwight noticed several non-human species, a group of Centurions moving with the fluid grace of beings evolved in higher gravity environments, their translucent skin revealing the complex circulatory systems beneath. A solitary vegan symbiote whose subtle facial markings indicated advanced integration with their internal companion organism. 2 Proxima crystallines whose silicon-based bodies refracted light in hypnotic patterns. Each species maintained a respectful distance from others, creating invisible boundaries of personal space that varied according to evolutionary history and cultural norms. Despite this diversity, Dwight found his thoughts returning to the Nyan woman at the window. Her solitude had seemed deliberate rather than circumstantial, a chosen isolation rather than an imposed one. Was it merely the typical Nyan preference for minimal social interaction that Helena had described? or something more specific to this particular individual? The question intrigued him on both professional and personal levels. His contemplation was interrupted as he spotted Ellison's moving through the far end of the arrival hall, her blue skin making her instantly recognizable among the predominantly human crowd. Making a decision that would alter the course of both their lives, he navigated through the throng of new arrivals, positioning himself directly in Ellison's path. "Hello, I'm Dwight from Earth," he said, offering a small, genuine smile. Up close, he could see the subtle patterns in her blue skin, the way her eyes caught the light like faceted amethyst. Her features were humanoid in general arrangement: 2 eyes, central nose, mouth, but the proportions were different, creating a face of alien beauty. Her movements possessed a fluid grace that suggested both superior physical conditioning and a fundamentally different muscular skeletal structure. Allison halted. Her violet eyes surveyed him with a detached interest one might show a peculiar insect. No warmth softened her features. No acknowledgement of his greeting crossed her face. She simply tilted her head slightly, a gesture that emphasized the alien architecture of her facial structure. Without a word, she stepped around him and continued walking, her movements fluid and precise as flowing water. The abrupt dismissal triggered conflicting responses in Dwight. Professional fascination with this textbook display of Nenian social behavior alongside a more personal disappointment at the failed connection. His academic training had prepared him for such cultural differences, but the emotional impact of direct experience proved stronger than theoretical understanding. The encounter left him with a renewed determination to bridge the communication gap, to find some point of connection across the evolutionary divide. Dwight stood frozen for a moment, surprised by the complete dismissal. His academic understanding of Nenian social protocols had not prepared him for the reality of such direct rejection. Before he could decide whether to attempt another approach or retreat with his dignity intact, a voice spoke from behind him. "That went well," commented a male voice. Dwight turned to find a lanky man with close-cropped blonde hair observing the interaction with evident amusement. "Arlen Novick, Engineering Corps. You must be either extraordinarily brave or thoroughly uninformed about Nenian social customs." Dwight Matthews, Environmental Adaptation. He shook the offered hand, grateful for the human connection after Ellison's cold reception. "What did I miss about Nenian customs?" They considered direct approaches from strangers to be aggressive, borderline threatening. Arlen's eyes crinkled at the corners, suggesting frequent laughter. "You basically just challenged her to a dominance contest in the middle of a public space. In traditional Nenian culture, she would have been within her rights to physically subdue you for such an affront. Physically subdue? You're joking." Dwight glanced in the direction Ellison's had gone, reassessing the interaction with this new information. Only partly. Modern Nianians understand enough about other species to make allowances, but the instinctive response remains. Their evolutionary history includes territorial defense mechanisms that would make Earth's apex predators look cuddly by comparison. Arlen clapped Dwight on the shoulder. "Don't worry though, they're also pragmatic enough to make allowances for alien ignorance. Just don't try it again without proper introduction through Mutual professional connection. What would proper introduction protocol involve? Dwight asked, mentally filing away this information for future reference. His training had covered basic Ninian cultural concepts, but clearly lacked crucial practical details. Ideally, a third party with established professional standing introduces you in a work context, emphasizing your research credentials rather than personal attributes. Arlen explained, Nanny respect competence above all else. Personal relationships, when they form at all, develop only after professional respect has been established. Helena approached, an amused smile playing on her lips. I see you've met our resident Ninian ambassador and received the traditional welcome, and I see Arlen has found you. He has a radar for newcomers who might need saving from cultural missteps. Someone has to welcome the fresh meat before the academy chews them up. Arlen replied good-naturedly, I was just explaining our blue friends. Charming response. Do they not cover non-human greeting protocols in orientation anymore? They do, Dwight admitted, feeling somewhat foolish. I may have skipped that section to focus on the environmental data. Seems that was an oversight. Everyone makes at least one major cultural mistake there. First week, Helena assured him. Centurions still talk about the research assistant who tried to shake appendages with their respiratory filters. Seems I've chosen the most challenging introduction possible, Dwight acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile. Everyone needs a challenge, Arlen said. Besides, we're all far from home. Here, speaking of which, let me show you to your quarters before the orientation briefing. Director Buddy doesn't tolerate tardiness, especially from new arrivals. As Arlen led him through the academy's complex network of corridors, Dwight found himself contemplating the unexpected emotions triggered by his brief encounter with Ellis. His professional interest in xenobiology had always included a deep curiosity about non-human psychology, but this experience had affected him on a more personal level than anticipated. Something about her solitude had resonated with his own experience of isolation despite being surrounded by others, an unexpected point of potential connection across the species divide. The irony of feeling connection through mutual disconnect was not lost on him. The academy structure resembled complex honeycomb with specialized sectors connected by transparent tubes and reinforced corridors. Dwight tried to memorize the layout as Arlen led him through a bewildering series of intersections, access points, and security checkpoints. The environmental systems created noticeable microclimates. In different sectors, some areas were cooler, others more humid, all calibrated to the comfort requirements of different species or research needs. The entire academy runs on an artificial day-8 cycle based on Earth standard time, Arlen explained as they entered residential sector. 3 24-hour rotations with appropriate light spectrum shifts. Take some adjustment for non-Earth species, but most adapt. Crystallines from Proxima b are the exception. They maintain their own 70-hour cycle and basically ignore the rest of us. How many different species are currently stationed here? Dwight asked, fascinated by the diversity he'd already glimpsed in passing. His previous experience had been limited to the occasional non-human visitor to Earth's research facilities, never the immersive experience of being surrounded by multiple extraterrestrial species, at last count, 17 representing 12 planetary systems. Humans are still the majority, followed by vegan symbiotes and Centurion. Aquatics, Arlen stopped before a nondescript door marked with the alpha numeric designation RS-342. Home sweet home, at least for the duration of your posting. The door slid open at Arlen's gesture, revealing quarters that were utilitarian but comfortable, a sleep chamber, hygiene unit, workstation, and small food preparation area. The view screen on one wall displayed a real-time image of the landscape outside the dome. Rolling violet plains stretching to a horizon dominated by jagged mountains whose peaks disappeared into perpetual clouds. The view helps with adaptation, Arlen noted following Dwight's gaze. Reminds you where you are, prevents the disassociation that some newcomers experience. Your environmental controls are there. He pointed to panel by the bed. Orientation starts in 30 minutes. Communal hall alpha. Any questions before I leave you to settle in? Dwight hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since his encounter in the arrival hall. The Nean researcher. Ellis, you said direct approaches are considered aggressive. What would be considered an appropriate interaction? Arlen studied him with newfound interest. Professional collaboration is your best approach. Nenians respect competence and efficiency. Find a legitimate research connection. Contribute something substantive, and she might acknowledge your existence. He paused at the door. But I should warn you, there's a betting pool on new arrivals who attempt to befriend our resident Blue Ice Queen. No one succeeded yet. I enjoy long odds, Dwight replied with a slight smile. Then you've come to the right corner of the galaxy. With that, Arlen departed, leaving Dwight to unpack his meager possessions and contemplate the strange new world he had entered. The orientation session proved less informative than Dwight had hoped. Director Buddy, a tall, imposing man with dark skin and prematurely white hair, delivered a standard welcome speech emphasizing the Academy's mission of fostering interspecies scientific cooperation. The safety protocol section confirmed what Dwight already knew from his preparation. NIA-3 was fundamentally hostile to most forms of life, making the Academy's environmental systems not just a convenience but a necessity for survival. Any breach in the dome would expose inhabitants to toxic atmospheric compounds and potentially lethal radiation levels. More interesting than the formal presentation was the opportunity to observe the assembled researchers from various species. The human contingent dominated numerically, but representatives from other worlds created a striking tableau of evolutionary diversity. Centurions with their translucent skin and visible circulatory systems occupied a section modified to provide the higher humidity. They required a group of vegan symbiotes appearing outwardly human but hosting internal organisms that enhanced their cognitive functions. Sat together near the front, their subtle facial markings the only visible sign of their unique biology. In the rear, a single crystalline being stood motionless, its silicon-based body refracting light in hypnotic patterns. Ellison's was notably absent from the orientation, a fact that Arlen commented on as they exited the hall afterward. Our Nyanian colleague considers these sessions redundant, he explained. She reviewed the materials before arrival and deemed physical. Attendance and inefficient use of. Research time, logical Dwight. Acknowledged though he found himself somewhat disappointed by her absence, if somewhat unsociable. Nanians don't prioritize socialization the way humans do, Helena added, joining their conversation. They find our need for constant interaction puzzling at best, irritating at worst. Their own society functions with minimal verbal communication. They consider most human conversation to be empty noise, yet they join the Interplanetary Research Consortium. Dwight pointed out that suggests some value placed on cross-species interaction. Value and enjoyment are different concepts, Helena replied. With a knowing smile, they recognize the practical benefits of collaboration without necessarily finding the process pleasant, much like humans recognize the value of exercise without all of us enjoying the gym. Dwight laughed at the comparison. Fair enough. So what's the secret to successful collaboration with our blue colleagues? Respect their space, communicate efficiently, and demonstrate competence in your field, Helena advised. Neans have no patience for uncertainty or unnecessary discussion. Present your ideas clearly, support them with evidence, and accept criticism without emotional displays. Basically, be the opposite of a typical human, Arland added with a grin. Now, who wants to see the real heart of the Academy? The official tour doesn't include the engineering corps' private lounge, which happens to have the best synthesized coffee this side of the Orion Arm. As they walked toward the engineering sector, Dwight mentally reviewed his interaction with Ellis, already forming strategies for a second approach that would respect Nenian cultural norms while establishing the professional connection he sought. The challenge appealed to him on multiple levels, academically as an exercise in cross-species communication, professionally as a potential research collaboration opportunity, and personally, though he was reluctant to examine this aspect too closely, as a chance to understand the solitary figure whose brief glance had somehow connected with him across the species barrier. Ellison's occupied quarters in an isolated sector primarily reserved for non-human species whose environmental needs differed significantly from Earth standard. Her living space was sparse, functional, devoid of decorations or personal items, a stark contrast to the human quarters already cluttered with photographs, trinkets, and colorful textiles from home. The lighting remained at 40% of standard, creating pools of shadow that her keen vision navigated effortlessly. Upon returning to her quarters after the unwelcome encounter in the arrival hall, she engaged in a brief meditation cycle designed to process and compartmentalize the experience. The human's direct approach had triggered autonomic responses associated with territorial challenge, elevated heart rate, increased adrenal production, heightened sensory awareness. These physiological reactions were automatic, evolutionary holdovers from Nyania's competitive ecosystem, but managing their psychological impact required conscious effort. The meditation technique, developed over thousands of years of Nanian evolutionary psychology, allowed her to analyze the interaction objectively. The human Dwight he had named himself had exhibited none of the traditional human threat displays. His posture had remained open rather than confrontational, his vocal patterns modulated in the frequency range associated with friendly overtures, rather than challenge. Most notable had been his direct eye contact maintained, beyond the duration typical of casual human interaction but without the aggressive staring that would signal dominance assertion. These observations suggested that his approach, while inappropriate by Nanian standards, had been intended as a social greeting, rather than a territorial challenge. The realization did not change the fundamental impropriety of the interaction, but did reclassify it from potential threat to mere cultural ignorance. Having resolved this ambiguity, Ellison's completed her meditation cycle and turned her attention to more productive matters. She accessed her research terminal, reviewing the latest data on xenobiological adaptation patterns among transplanted Earth flora. The project had occupied her for the past 17 months, studying how plants from Earth's varied biomes adjusted their growth patterns, chlorophyll production, and reproductive cycles to Nia3's radiation spectrum. The work was precise, methodical, and blissfully free from the unpredictable emotional variables that complicated interactions with sentient subjects. An alert appeared on her screen. New research personnel assignment. She scanned the list dispassionately until a name triggered recognition. Dwight Matthews, environmental adaptation. Research assigned to laboratory Epsilon, adjacent to her own workspace. The human from the arrival hall, the one with the direct gaze and inappropriate greeting. She closed the notification with a gesture that betrayed mild irritation. Humans had an unfortunate tendency to attempt friendly overtures that invariably disrupted established work patterns. She would need to establish clear boundaries immediately. A secondary notification demanded her attention. Updated research priorities from the Interplanetary Research Consortium. She opened the file, scanning its contents with increasing concern. The consortium had shifted funding toward adaptive agriculture projects, deprioritizing pure xenobiological research. The chain threatened to reduce her resource allocation by nearly 30% in the coming research cycle. Ellison's leaned back from the terminal, considering the implications. Her current project would need restructuring to emphasize practical applications rather than theoretical understanding. Perhaps there was potential in combining her xenobiological data with the environmental adaptation research being conducted in laboratory Epsilon. The thought of collaborative work with a newly arrived human was not appealing, but pragmatism outweighed preference. Scientific advancement and project funding took priority over personal comfort. She composed a brief message to Director Buddy outlining a proposal for integrated research across departments, emphasizing the practical agricultural applications that would align with the consortium's new priorities. The message was concise, logical, and completely devoid of the frustration she felt at having her research direction externally redirected. Emotions had no place in professional communication. After sending the message, Ellison's completed her evening meditation routine, a series of mental exercises designed to process and compartmentalize the day's experiences. The technique allowed for efficient emotional regulation without suppression. Contrary to human perception, Nanans experienced emotions deeply but managed them differently, treating them as data to be analyzed rather than experiences to be indulged. The human's face appeared in her. Meditation, Dwight Matthews with his direct gaze and inappropriate smile. Something about that brief encounter had registered on a level beyond conscious thought. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of his approach, so different from the cautious avoidance most humans display toward her. Or perhaps it was the complete absence of fear in his expression and unusual response when confronting a species known for superior physical strength and occasional territorial aggression. Ellison's completed her meditation with a final mental cataloging of the day's events, then prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the potential necessity of collaborative work with Laboratory Epsilon. She would approach the situation with appropriate professional detachment, regardless of any anomalous reactions to its newly assigned researcher. Every morning, Ellis followed the same routine. She awoke before the artificial daylight cycle began, performed a series of stretching exercises that made her live body bend in ways impossible for human anatomy, then headed to the training facility during its least populated hours. There she pushed herself through a grueling regimen, pull-ups that would exhaust most humans after 5 repetitions, sprints at speeds that blurred her form, weight training with settings that would crush human bones. The physical exertion served multiple purposes, maintaining the muscle density necessary in Nia 3, slightly lower gravity, burning excess energy that might otherwise manifest as emotional volatility, and providing a rare opportunity to express her natural physicality without inhibition. On Thayam, physical prowess was celebrated within carefully prescribed context. Here, surrounded by physically weaker species, she constrained her movements, limited her strength, concealed her natural capabilities behind a mask of restrained efficiency. On this particular morning, her solitude was interrupted. 3 humans occupied the far corner of the facility. Dwight, along with Arlen and a third man, Ellison's recognized as Eric T. Bass from engineering, attempted to repair one of the malfunctioning training simulators. Their presence disrupted her routine, forcing her to adjust her exercises to avoid their section of the facility. The motivator coil is completely fused, Arison declared, examining scorch component with expert eyes. His stocky build and perpetually oil-stained hands marked him as someone who regularly worked with mechanical systems. Rather than theoretical concepts, we should replace the entire unit. Requisitioning new equipment takes weeks, Arlen replied, handing him a specialized tool. Can we bypass the damage section? Most users only need the basic resistance functions, Arison muttered under his breath as he struggled with a stubborn component. Humans always meddle with things they don't understand, he grumbled, wiping sweat from his forehead. This simulator was calibrated for Centurion physiology. We should leave it for their maintenance team. The Centurions are occupied with the atmospheric pressure fluctuations in Sector 7, Arlen replied. Besides, the basic operating principles are universal. The simulator just needs recalibration. Dwight, who had been studying the simulator's control system, suddenly looked up with an expression of realization. The issue isn't the motivator coil itself, it's the input sensor. It's calibrated for Centurion neural patterns, but the override protocol is active. That's creating the feedback loop that fried the coil. Arison frowned, then examined the section. Dwight indicated, "How did you know that?" "I studied adaptive interface design as part of my environmental systems training," Dwight explained, retrieving a diagnostic tool from the kit. Organisms don't just adapt to environments, they interact with them through increasingly sophisticated interfaces. The principle applies to equipment as well as natural systems. Paused in her routine, her peripheral vision catching the coordinated movements of the humans working together. They communicated with minimal words, anticipating each other's needs, handing tools before they were requested. Dwight's analytical approach was particularly noteworthy. He observed before acting, identified core issues rather than symptoms, and implemented solutions with minimal wasted motion. Dwight laughed, picking up a wrench and tossing it deftly between his hands before placing it back in the toolbox. "Maybe that's why we survive against the odds. We poke at things until they make sense, then adapt our understanding, rather than expecting the universe to conform to our preconceptions." The observation struck Allison's as surprisingly insightful for a human. New thought formed in her mind, one she had never considered before. They are not as helpless as they appear. Realization disturbed her established understanding. Nyan educational materials portrayed humans as inefficient, overly social creatures whose evolutionary success relied on sheer reproductive numbers rather than individual capability. Yet here she observed 3 specimens displaying coordinated problem-solving behaviors that resembled in some respects the precision of Nanian hunting groups. "Calibration sequence complete," announced Arison after several minutes of concentrated work. "Testing cycle initiating." The simulator hummed to life, generating a holographic obstacle course designed to test both strength and agility. Arlen stepped onto the platform first, navigating the course with surprising grace for his lanky frame. His movements suggested previous military training, economical, precise, with minimal wasted energy. He completed the course in a respectable time, though his breathing was labored by the final obstacle. Dwight followed his performance, revealing a different approach, less fluid but more analytical, studying each obstacle before engaging, learning from Arlen's attempt where Arlen had relied on speed. Dwight used calculated efficiency, conserving energy for the most challenging sections. His completion time was only marginally slower despite his obviously less extensive training. Ellis found herself continuing to observe long after she should have moved to the next phase of her exercise routine. When Dwight completed the course, he glanced in her direction as though aware of her attention. Their eyes met briefly across the training facility, and something in his expression, a curiosity without judgment, an openness without demand, registered on a level beyond conscious analysis. She immediately resumed her training, increasing the intensity to compensate for the lost time. Her movements became more forceful, pushing against the constraints she typically imposed on herself in the presence of others. A small demonstration perhaps, though for whose benefit remained unclear even to herself. Later that day, Ellison's encountered Dwight again, this time in the research corridor connecting their respective laboratories. He carried a collection of plant specimens, early growth seedlings from Earth's Temperate zones, each carefully contained in atmosphere-controlled cylinders. Ellison's, he acknowledged, with a polite nod, neither invasively friendly nor artificially distant. I understand you're the lead researcher on xenobiological adaptation. These specimens are showing unusual chlorophyll mutations under NEO3's radiation bands. I thought the data might complement your ongoing study. Approach was strategic. She recognized establishing contact through legitimate research concerns rather than social overtures. It demonstrated an understanding of Ninian professional protocols that surprised her, especially from a newly arrived human. She examined the specimens without touching the containers, noting the purplish tinge to leaves that should have been green. Radiation signature is affecting protein synthesis at the cellular level. She observed, her professional interest temporarily overriding her aversion to unnecessary interaction. That was my assessment as well. The effect appears most pronounced in specimens from higher elevations on Earth, plants already adapted to increased UV exposure. Dwight's tone remained professional, focused on the science rather than social engagement. The complete data set is available in the shared research database indexed under Project Helanthus. Ellis recognized the approach for what it was, an attempt to establish professional rapport as a precursor to social interaction, a common human strategy. Nevertheless, the research itself had merit, and the observation about elevation adaptation aligned with patterns she had documented in her own work. I will review the findings, she said, then added with reluctance born of scientific integrity, your observation regarding elevation adaptation correlates with patterns I have documented in 3 other Earth species. A look of genuine pleasure crossed Dwight's face at this minimal acknowledgement. I'd be interested in those correlations if you're willing to share your analysis. The data is available in the research database, she replied, then continued toward her laboratory without further conversation. Behind her, she sensed rather than saw his smile, satisfaction at having established initial scientific contact. The encounter left her with an unusual sensation, not the irritation she typically experienced after human interactions, but something more complex. Professional respect perhaps mingled with a reluctant recognition of compatible research interests. She would need to adjust her assessment of this particular human. Dwight Matthews might prove a more valuable research connection than anticipated despite his species-typical limitations. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Dwight found legitimate reasons to consult with Ellison's on research matters. Each interaction remained professional, brief, and focused on scientific exchange rather than personal connection. Gradually, imperceptibly, the length of these consultations extended. Ellison's began to volunteer information beyond the minimum required, occasionally asking questions about Earth ecosystems that revealed genuine curiosity beneath her detached exterior. Director Buddy noticed the developing professional relationship, considering it a small but significant victory for the Academy's mission of fostering interspecies cooperation. He mentioned as much during a research coordination meeting that both Ellison's and Dwight attended. The consortium has expressed particular interest in your collaborative findings on adaptive chlorophyll mutations, he noted. Addressing both researchers, they've allocated additional resources for expanded research in this direction. Consider formalizing your collaboration with a joint research proposal. Ellison stiffened slightly at the suggestion. Informal consultation was one thing. Formal collaboration implied a level of ongoing interaction that pushed against her comfort boundaries. The current arrangement has proven adequately efficient, she replied, but not optimally efficient, Director Buddy countered, familiar enough with Ninian psychology to frame his argument in terms of efficiency rather than social benefit. Duplicated research processes, parallel documentation, separate analysis of complementary data all represent resource expenditure that could be eliminated through formalized collaboration. Put in those terms, resistance would be illogical. Ellison's inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Reasonable assessment. I will prepare a collaboration framework. Dwight, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke carefully. I suggest a distributed research model with clear domain separation and scheduled integration points. This would maintain individual work autonomy while maximizing collective output. The suggestion demonstrated an understanding of Nanian work preferences that surprised Allison's. She glanced at him with newfound consideration. An acceptable approach. We can establish operational parameters this afternoon, Director. Buddy suppressed a smile, recognizing the significance of what had just transpired. In Ninian terms, Ellis had just accepted Dwight as a legitimate research partner, a status few humans had achieved with her species. The Academy functioned as both a research facility and a training center for inter-species cooperation. Various experiments were conducted daily, most involving energy manipulation, atmospheric adaptation, and resource optimization. Critical skills for survival on the harsh frontier planets. During one such experiment, a month into the Earth students' arrival, disaster struck. The day began unremarkably. Ellison's monitored plant specimens under variable light conditions. Dwight worked 3 laboratories down the corridor analyzing soil composition samples. Helena conducted psychological evaluations of adaptation stress in a newly arrived group of researchers. Arland and Erikin collaborated on power distribution improvements for the Academy's Western quadrant. The first indication of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the floor, a tremor so slight that many humans failed to notice it. Allison's paused, her sensitive nervous system registering the disturbance. She secured her specimens automatically, then moved to the laboratory entrance, scanning the corridor for visible signs of malfunction. The emergency communication system activated with a low-pitched tone that immediately captured all personnel's attention. Attention all personnel, Director. Buddy's voice announced, the formal calm of his tone belied by its underlying tension. We are experiencing power fluctuations in the experimental energy research lab. Precautionary containment protocols are in effect. Personnel in sectors 3 through 5 should prepare for possible evacuation. Ellison's moved quickly to implement laboratory security measures. Her research specimens represented months of work that could be lost if environmental controls failed. As she transferred the most sensitive samples to self-contained preservation units, Dwight appeared at The laboratory entrance, the energy research team lost containment on their prototype reactor, he reported without preamble, respecting her preference for direct communication. They've initiated emergency shutdown, but the system is showing cascade failure warnings before Ellisons could respond. The world exploded around them. The explosion ripped through the energy research block. Without warning, a blinding flash preceded the concussive wave that shattered reinforced windows and buckled interior walls. Alarms screamed to life. Red emergency lights pulsed in thick smoke billowed through ventilation shaft. Chaos erupted as students and instructors alike scrambled for safety. In the confusion, structural supports began to fail, sending chunks of ceiling crashing down. Ellis had been monitoring a separate experiment when the blast wave hit. Her naturally enhanced reflexes allowed her to brace against the shock while nearby humans were thrown off balance. The laboratory's emergency containment protocols activated, sealing hazardous materials and protecting critical research. Through the thickening smoke, she spotted Helena stumbling beneath a groaning section of ceiling, disoriented from a head wound that left a trail of crimson across her forehead. Acting on instinct rather than conscious decision, Ellis lunged forward, grabbed the human woman around the waist and pulled her into the corridor just as the structure collapsed. The sound of pulverized composite materials filled the air, along with the acrid scent of electrical fires and the hissing of ruptured pneumatic systems. "Thank you," Helena gasped, pressing a hand to her bleeding forehead. What happened? Was it the power core? Before Ellisons could respond, Dwight emerged from an adjacent lab, his face smudged with soot, makeshift filter mask covering his nose and mouth. His eyes widened at the sight of Helena's injury, then moved to Ellison's with an expression of relief that she found difficult to interpret. "The main energy research lab," he explained, voice muffled behind his mask. "Something went wrong with the containment field for the experimental reactor. Secondary explosions are happening throughout the power distribution system." Without hesitation, he rushed to help, supporting Helena's other side as they navigated the smoke-filled passage. Together they half carried, half dragged the semi-conscious woman toward the emergency evacuation point designated. For this sector, their progress was impeded by fallen debris, structural damage, and the growing number of injured personnel seeking the same exit. "The ventilation system is compromised." Eriken's voice crackled through damaged communicator that Dwight had salvaged from a fallen security officer. "If pressure continues to build, the dome integrity will fail. Engineering estimates 19 minutes before critical failure." Ellison's jaw tightened, muscles flexing beneath her blue skin. Implications were clear to everyone. Dome breach meant exposure to NEA-3's toxic atmosphere, a lethal mixture of sulfur compounds and metallic particulate that would destroy human lung tissue within minutes and even challenge her own species' advanced respiratory filtration. It meant death for every living being inside the academy. They needed to act immediately. The medical bay had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Director Buddy attempting to coordinate evacuation efforts moved through the crowded space with purposeful strides. But communications between sectors were fragmenting. Injured students lay on every available surface while medical staff moved between them with increasing Desperation, we've lost contact with Sectors 5 through 9, reported a communications technician, her voice strained. The emergency shelter in Sector 4 is at capacity. Environmental systems are failing in sequence. The manual airlock controls for Sector 7 are jammed. Another voice added, we can't release the pressure buildup, Director. Buddy turned to Eric, who had arrived minutes earlier with a group of engineering personnel. Options. Automated systems are compromised, Arkin replied, consulting a diagnostic tablet, whose screen flickered ominously. The main computer core took damage in the initial explosion. It's running on auxiliary systems, but critical functions are degrading. The manual override in the lower technical levels might still function, but the access corridors are registering extreme temperatures from the power system overload, a Centurion engineer added through his translation device. Structural integrity calculations indicate dome failure will begin in the western quadrant. Atmospheric containment cannot be maintained beyond 15 minutes at current degradation rates. The gravity of the situation settled over everyone in the room. Standard evacuation protocols required at least 30 minutes to complete, time they simply didn't have. The Academy's emergency shuttles could accommodate perhaps a third of the current personnel, leaving the majority facing potential exposure to NIA-3's lethal atmosphere. Dwight exchanged looks with Allison's across the crowded room. No words were needed. They both understood what needed to be done. They slipped away from the medical bay and descended toward the lower technical levels where the manual override systems were located. The journey through the damaged academy tested them both. Emergency lighting function sporadically, leaving them to navigate through total darkness in some corridors. Fallen debris required them to climb, crawl, and squeeze through spaces barely large enough for Dwight's human frame. Twice they were forced to retreat from passages filled with caustic smoke, seeking alternative routes through the labyrinthine structure. You should proceed alone, Dwight suggested, after a particularly difficult section left him gasping for breath. Your physiology gives you better chances. Inefficient, Ellison's replied curtly. The manual override requires 2 operators for activation. Continuing together maximizes success probability. The temperature rose dramatically as they descended. Metal groaned under pressure and the floor radiated heat from overloaded systems below. Sweat poured down Dwight's face. His breathing labored in the increasingly toxic atmosphere. Ellison's fared better, her Nanian physiology more resilient to temperature extremes and atmospheric contaminants, but even she felt the strain of extended exertion in hostile conditions. They reached the control room after what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only 20 minutes of desperate navigation. The manual airlock release, a massive wheel mechanism designed as a fail-safe for exactly this type of catastrophic system failure, was nearly glowing with heat from the overloaded power conduits running behind the wall. The system requires simultaneous activation of both release mechanisms, Allison observed, studying the control panel. Sequential operation within a 3-second window. Dwight nodded, moving to the second wheel on the opposite wall. On your signal. Dwight gripped the wheel and pulled with all his strength, planting his feet and leaning back with his full weight. His palms sizzled against the metal, and he cried out but didn't release his hold. The wheel refused to budge, locked in position by warped metal and emergency security protocols. Ellison's moved beside him, her own hands reaching for the mechanism. The color of her skin shifted from deep blue to an ashen gray, a physiological response to extreme stress that humans lacked. Her specialized skin cells altered their pigmentation to increase heat reflection, a survival mechanism evolved on Nana's harsh surface. Step aside, she commanded, her voice tight with exertion. I will complete this together, Dwight countered, maintaining his grip despite the pain. On three. For a moment she seemed ready to argue, to insist on Nyan self-reliance, but instead gave a curt nod. 1, 2, 3. With their combined strength, Dwight's desperate human determination, and a licensed superior Nean physiology, they rotated the mechanism. The airlock doors shuddered, then slowly parted, allowing pressurized air to escape in a controlled manner rather than through catastrophic dome failure. Fresh, filtered air from the reserve systems began to circulate through the sector. Dwight slumped against the wall, cradling his burned hand against his chest. Despite the pain, a smile of relief crossed his face. Nice teamwork, he managed through gritted teeth. Before Ellison's could respond, the emergency lighting failed. Darkness engulfed them, broken only by the faint glow of residual indicator lights on the control panels. In the sudden silence, their breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Dwight's labored and ragged, Ellison's controlled but rapid. A crackling sound emerged from Dwight's communicator, which had been damaged during their descent but still functioned intermittently. Arlen's voice came through, weak and interrupted by static. I'm trapped in third block. Laboratory smoke, can't breathe. Structural collapse blocking exit. Dwight pushed himself upright, determination overriding pain. We have to get to him. The structural integrity of that section is compromised. Ellison's countered, her analytical mind calculating probabilities. The risk is unacceptable. The pressure stabilization we achieve must be maintained by emergency crews returning through damaged sectors. Introduces unnecessary hazard. He's my friend, Dwight said, simply, as if that explained everything. Ellison studied him in the dim emergency lighting, trying to comprehend the human willingness to risk survival for emotional connection. On Nana, such decisions would be made based on cold calculation, the relative value of the individual to the group, the probability of successful rescue, the resources required versus potential gain. The probability of reaching him alive is less than 17%, she stated. The probability of all three of us surviving after rescue is less than 4%. I didn't ask for the odds, Dwight replied, already moving toward the exit. I'm going. You should proceed to the evacuation point. Ellison's considered arguing further, but recognized the set of Dwight's jaw, the resolution in his eyes. Humans were notorious for their irrational loyalty to their social connections. After a moment she nodded. Curtly, we proceed with caution. Your knowledge of human resilience combined with my physical capabilities increases survival probability to approximately 23%. I'll take those odds, Dwight said, managing a pained smile. Lead the way. Your vision is better in low light. They navigated the darkened corridor slowly, using the heat signatures that Allison Could detect through the metal walls, too. Avoid hot spots where fires raged behind. Sealed doors, the air grew increasingly. Difficult to breathe, thick with dust. And chemical particles, Dwight tied a piece of fabric over his mouth and nose. But it provided minimal protection. His lungs burned and each breath became a struggle. Ellison's maintained a pace that challenged Dwight without exceeding his capabilities. Occasionally she would stop and listen, her auditory sensitivity detecting structural stresses that human ears missed. Twice she altered their course seconds before. Ceiling sections collapsed where they would have been standing. How do you know? Dwight asked after the second near miss. Metal speaks before it breaks, she replied. The frequency changes, your species cannot hear it. The response was automatic, but she realized with mild surprise that she had volunteered information unnecessarily. A behavior typical of human interaction. Patterns rather than Nenian efficiency. The crisis situation was affecting her normal protocols, creating behavioral adaptations that would require careful examination during her next meditation cycle. After what seemed like hours but was perhaps only 40 minutes of careful progress, they reached the corridor leading to the laboratory where Arlen was trapped. The entrance was blocked by fallen debris, structural beams, ceiling panels, and tangles of cabling formed a nearly impenetrable barrier. Smoke seeped through the cracks, carrying the distinctive, acrid scent of burning synthetic materials. Dwight immediately began shifting smaller pieces of metal and composite materials, ignoring the way they scorched his already injured hands. His movements betrayed both desperation and exhaustion, but he continued with single-minded determination that a lessons found simultaneously illogical and compelling. A lens assessed the larger structural beam that had collapsed across the doorway. Its weight exceeded what any human could lift, perhaps even what she could move alone. Using a broken pipe as a lever, she positioned it under the beam and applied her considerable strength. Her body trembled with the effort, blue skin darkening with exertion as she slowly raised the massive obstruction. Now she grunted. Quickly, Dwight ducked under the raised beam and disappeared into the smoke-filled room. Long moments passed, each second increasing the strain on Ellison's muscles as she held the crushing weight of the beam. Just as her strength began to falter, movement appeared in the doorway. Dwight emerged, supporting Arlen, who was coughing violently but conscious. Blood-streaked, his face from a head wound similar to Helena's, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle that indicated a broken bone. Don't leave me, Arlen gasped. Between coughs, his eyes wide with the primal fear of abandonment. Not planning to, Dwight replied, his voice strained but steady. They retreated down the corridor, but the smoke was thickening. All three collapsed near an emergency airlock, their lungs desperate for clean air. Ellison's pressed the manual release, but the small indicator light remained red. The system was offline. We need another route, she managed, her normally melodic voice rough from smoke inhalation. Arlen leaned heavily against the wall, his breathing shallow and labored. There's a maintenance shaft behind the environmental control panel. He pointed weakly to a section of wall marked with technical specifications. Emergency access for repair crews. Dwight moved to the panel and pried it open with trembling hands. Behind it lay a narrow vertical shaft with ladder. Rungs embedded in the wall. It's tight. But we can make it. Arlen first then. You Ellisons, I'll bring up the rear. Arlen shook his head weakly. Can't. Climb, arms broken, then I'll carry you. Dwight insisted. Ellisons interrupted. Inefficient, I have greater strength. I will carry him before either human could protest. She lifted Arlen as carefully as his injuries allowed and began ascending the ladder one-handed. Feat of strength that would have been impossible for most humans. Dwight followed, his movements increasingly labored as exhaustion and smoke. Inhalation took their toll. They emerged in an upper corridor that showed less damage than the lower levels. The air was clearer, though still far from clean. Arlen had lapsed into semi-consciousness, responding only to direct questions with mumbled answers. At that moment, Eriken's voice came through the communicator again, clearer. This time, attention all personnel. Cooling system stabilized in sectors 1 through 3. Repeat, cooling system stabilized. Proceed to evacuation points. In stable sectors, the news should have been entirely positive, but something in Eric's tone alerted both Dwight and Ellisons to a hidden concern. Their suspicions were confirmed moments later, when he added, water containment in sectors 4 and 5 has been compromised. Flooding in lower levels. Proceed to upper evacuation points only through failing emergency lights. Ellison spotted water seeping under a doorway at the end of their corridor. She grabbed Dwight's arm, pulling him toward a maintenance stairwell. Up, we must go up. They struggled up the stairs, supporting Arlen between them. The metal steps were slick with water and ash treacherous under their exhausted feet. Halfway up, Dwight's foot slipped on a step made slippery by the mixture of water and debris. He lurched sideways, momentum carrying him toward the open side of the stairwell. For a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the edge of a 20 drop to the flooded level below, his free arm windmilling in a desperate attempt to regain balance. Ellison's hand shot out, catching his wrist in an iron grip. With one arm still supporting Arlen, she held Dwight suspended over the drop, her muscles straining against the combined weight. In that moment, the full difference between Nyan and human physiology was displayed. What would have been impossible for a human was merely extremely difficult for her. We will not die today, she stated, her eyes locked with his. With strength born of desperation, she pulled him back to safety. They continued their ascent, each step a victory against fatigue and injury. The water level rose below them, carrying debris from the damaged sections and threatening to flood even higher levels of the academy. On the upper level, Helena waited with a group of survivors who had managed to reach the emergency shelter. She rushed forward as she saw them emerge, helping to lay Arlen on a makeshift bed. Dwight collapsed beside him, consciousness finally slipping away as the adrenaline drained from his system. His breathing was shallow, labored, each inhalation a struggle against smoke-damaged lungs. Breathe, come on, Dwight, breathe. Helena pressed her hands against his chest, trying to stimulate respiration. Her medical training took over despite her own injuries and exhaustion. He gasped suddenly, drawing a ragged breath into his smoke-damaged lungs. Helena broke down in tears of relief, clutching his hand as his breathing gradually stabilized. Around them, other survivors were receiving emergency medical attention. The limited resources stretched to cover dozens of injuries, ranging from minor lacerations to life-threatening trauma. Ellison sat nearby, observing the interaction with detached curiosity. Despite her own exhaustion, her body was covered in cuts and burns, blue blood seeping from several wounds. She made no move to treat her injuries, instead watching the humans care for one another with intense focus. A Centurion medic approached, offering to treat her wounds. She declined with a gesture, indicating that others had greater need. The medic hesitated, then nodded in understanding, before moving to help a young researcher with severe burns on his arms through the transparent walls of the emergency shelter. They could see the extent of the damage to the academy. Entire sections of the dome had collapsed, though the emergency containment fields prevented complete atmospheric breach. Fires still burned in isolated areas, their glow visible through smoke. Darkened corridors, water from ruptured cooling systems had flooded the lower levels, creating new hazards for rescue teams attempting to reach trapped personnel. Director Buddy arrived with a team of technicians several hours later. His face hardened as he surveyed the destruction, the injuries, the barely contained disaster that threatened the entire outpost. His gaze lingered on Dwight, Ellis, and Arlen, taking in their injuries and the evident signs of their journey through the damaged facility. You violated emergency protocol, he stated, looking directly at Dwight and Ellis. Direct orders were to evacuate to designated safe zones, not to attempt unauthorized rescue operations. His voice carried the weight of authority, but those who knew him well could detect the underlying relief that contradicted his stern words. Dwight pushed himself up on one elbow, his voice but defiant. The protocol would have killed us, he coughed violently, then continued. And Arlen, too. Sometimes survival requires adaptation, not rigid adherence to procedure. Buddy fell silent. Behind his stern expression, recognition dawned. These students had accomplished what no official response could have. They had saved lives through cooperation that transcended species differences, the very principle upon which the academy was founded. After a long moment he spoke again, his tone softer. Full report, both of you, when you're medically cleared. He turned to Helena. Status of the injured: 17 critical, 38 with moderate injuries. Unknown number still unaccounted for. She replied, professional demeanor reasserting itself. Medical supplies are limited. We need evacuation for the critical cases. Orbital medical shuttle inbound. Buddy confirmed. ETA 40 minutes. Prioritize the critical cases for immediate transport. As the director moved away to coordinate further rescue efforts, Helena turned to Dwight and Ellison's. You two should be on that shuttle, she said, examining Dwight's burned hands and Ellison's numerous lacerations. These injuries need proper treatment. Others first, Ellison stated simply. Dwight nodded in agreement, though the movement clearly caused him pain. We'll manage. Focus on those who won't. Helena looked between them, a slight smile touching her lips. Despite the dire circumstances, you know, for two people from different worlds, you're starting to sound remarkably alike. The observation hung in the air, unacknowledged by either of them, yet impossible to ignore. Something had changed in the crucible of crisis, a foundation laid for understanding that transcended species differences. Ellison's found herself contemplating this transformation with analytical interest rather than the resistance she might have expected from herself. Crisis situations often accelerated adaptation processes. This was merely another example of that biological principle, albeit in the social domain rather than the physical. The following days brought a succession of challenges as the Academy's surviving personnel struggled to stabilize the damaged facility. Emergency response teams arrived from the nearest outpost, bringing additional medical supplies and technical expertise. The most critically injured were evacuated to orbital medical facilities, while others were treated in temporary shelters established in the undamaged sectors. Ellison's found herself working alongside humans and other species in a coordinated effort to save what could be salvaged from the research laboratories. The disaster had erased many of the social barriers that typically separated different species, creating an environment of focused cooperation where efficiency took precedence over cultural differences. She observed Dwight organizing a team of researchers to retrieve critical data storage units from damaged sections. Despite his bandaged hands and the respiratory mask he still required, he worked tirelessly, demonstrating a resilience that challenged Nianian preconceptions about human fragility. When he succeeded in recovering the primary xenobiology database containing 3 years of her research, she acknowledged the achievement with more than her usual minimal response. Your effort preserved irreplaceable data. She told him, the scientific community is appreciative. Dwight recognized the significance of this departure from her typical communication style. Does that mean I've moved up in the betting pool? He asked with a tired smile. I am aware of that particular human recreational activity, she replied. Your odds have improved significantly. A week after the disaster, the Academy was largely empty. Many students had been evacuated to orbital medical facilities, while others had returned to their home planets, pending reconstruction of the damaged sections in temporary shelters erected outside the damaged dome. Medical staff continued treating those with less severe injuries who had remained behind. To assist with recovery efforts, Ellison sat beside Dwight's cot, her posture still formal despite the casual setting. Her own injuries had healed more rapidly than human wounds would, though several deeper lacerations were still visible. Against her blue skin, Dwight's hands remained heavily bandaged, but his smile was genuine when he saw her approach. The maintenance crews have stabilized the primary dome structure, she reported, falling back on professional communication as a comfortable default. Atmospheric integrity has been restored. In sectors 1 through 3, Director Buddy estimates partial research operations can resume within 14 days. Dwight nodded, adjusting his position. With the WSC and the xenobiology specimens, your research partially preserved. The emergency containment protocols functioned as designed in the laboratory sections. She hesitated, then added, your soil composition samples were also secured. The data can be recovered. Good to know my work survived, even if I almost didn't. Dwight said with a weak laugh that turned into a cough. Silence fell between them, comfortable in a way that would have been unimaginable before the disaster. Ellison studied his face, noting the fatigue lines around his eyes, the stubble that had grown during his days of recovery. The the resilience that showed in his expression despite evident pain. "You could have escaped on your own," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Why did you stay? Why help me find Arlen?" When the logical choice was self-preservation, the question caught her by surprise, not because of its content but because she had been contemplating the same point. During her meditation cycles, Ninian behavior typically prioritized survival above all other considerations. Her actions had deviated from this pattern in ways that required explanation, even to herself. Alison's considered the question carefully, taking time to examine her own motivations. On Nana, such introspection was encouraged. Understanding one's decisions led to more efficient future choices, yet this particular decision defied simple Ninian logic, because I am no longer merely Ninian, she said finally, the words carrying more significance than their simplicity suggested. This place, this academy, its purpose is to transcend planetary limitations. I have observed that humans excel at emotional connection, Ninians excel at survival. Calculation, perhaps optimal function, requires both. The statement hung between them, significant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. It represented not just personal growth, but the very mission of the academy itself, finding strength in diversity, advancement through cooperation. "I believe you may be right," Dwight replied softly. "Neither approach alone would have gotten us through this. The combination made survival possible." In adaptive synthesis, Ellison's agreed, finding the scientific framing comfortable. Environmental pressures often produce unexpected evolutionary responses. Is that what this is? Dwight asked. Evolution on an individual level, rather than a species level, but the principle applies. She paused, considering the implications more fully. Adaptation occurs most rapidly under extreme pressure. This crisis accelerated a process that might otherwise have taken years. The process of what? Understanding each other, understanding possibilities beyond our separate evolutionary paths. She met his gaze directly, an unusual gesture for a Nanian when communicating with another species. Your human expression for this concept would be becoming more than the sum of our parts. Dwight smiled, surprised and pleased by her use of a human idiom. I believe the appropriate Nyan response would be efficiency, achieved through complementary function. For the first time since he had known her, Ellison made a sound that might have been a laugh, a brief musical tone, quickly contained and accurate. Translation: across the recovery camp, evidence of this principle appeared everywhere. Erican and Arlen now sporting a stabilizing brace on his mended arm, assisted with dome repairs, alongside Centurion engineers, their previous antagonism forgotten in the wake of shared survival. Helena compiled reports on the psychological impact of the disaster, noting the unprecedented cooperation between species that had emerged during the crisis. Conversations everywhere centered on the human factor, the emotional connection that had proven more valuable than any technological solution in the face of catastrophe. In his temporary office, Director Buddy reviewed the preliminary disaster reports, focusing particularly on the accounts of Dwight in a licensed journey through the Damage Academy. Their combined strengths, Neonian physical capability and human emotional resilience, had achieved what neither could have alone. It was, he realized, the embodiment of the Academy's core mission. He signed an order that would change the future of interspecies training project to continue with expanded scope. Emotional cooperation is the primary criterion for success. All future training groups to include minimum 1 human and 1 non-human participant. Following weeks brought gradual improvement to both the Academy's physical structure and its social dynamics. Reconstruction teams worked continuously, restoring critical systems and repairing damaged sections. Research activities resumed in a limited capacity, with priority given to projects deemed essential by the Interplanetary Research Consortium. Dwight and Ellis found their professional collaboration expanding beyond the initial boundaries. Their joint research on adaptive biology attracted attention from the wider scientific community, leading to additional resource allocation and research assistants working together. Daily, they developed communication patterns that bridge the gap between human expressiveness and Nenian efficiency, a hybrid approach that maximized their collaborative potential. Personal boundaries shifted as well, though more gradually. Ellis began accepting Dwight's invitations to join research team meals occasionally rather than eating alone. Dwight learned to recognize the subtle signs of Nenian emotional states that most humans missed entirely. The slight color variations in her skin that indicated stress, curiosity, or satisfaction, the almost imperceptible changes in posture that communicated approval or disagreement more clearly than words. Other Academy personnel noticed the evolution of their relationship, though interpretations varied across species. Human researchers viewed it as a heartwarming narrative of cross-species friendship. Centurions observed it as an example of adaptive social symbiosis. The vegan symbiotes considered it a logical progression of mutually beneficial cooperation. Nians, who communicated with Ellisons, noted her expanded communication patterns without judgment, recognizing adaptation as a fundamental survival skill regardless of context. As twilight fell on Nia 3, painting the violet plains in deepening shades of indigo, Ellisons found herself standing by a temporary viewport that had been installed in the shelter structure. It reminded her of the window where she had first seen the Earth shuttle arrive, where everything had begun. This time she was not alone. Dwight stood beside her, watching the same alien landscape. The reconstruction team found something interesting in the wreckage, he said, breaking their companionable silence. My research notes on plant adaptation were fused with your xenobiology data during the power surge. The combined information revealed a pattern neither of us had identified independently. Unexpected data integration, Ellisons mused, a metaphor for our own experience perhaps. Dwight glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. Was that almost poetic coming from you? Metaphorical thinking has practical applications, she replied, but a hint of amusement colored her tone, transforming what would once have been a sterile observation into something approaching humor. Pattern recognition operates across multiple domains. Seeing parallels between different systems is scientifically valid and occasionally beautiful. Dwight added softly, the observation would have once triggered an immediate withdrawal on Alyssa's part, beauty being a subjective concept with no place in Scientific discourse, now she simply considered the statement neither accepting nor rejecting its premise. You know, he said quietly after another comfortable silence. Back then when I first saw you at the window, I thought you were an icy creature, beautiful but unreachable. For the first time in his presence, perhaps for the first time in years, Ellison smiled. The expression transformed her features, softening the sharp angles of her face, revealing a warmth that few had been privileged to witness, perhaps. But even ice has a heart if you manage to melt it. The admission of change, of growth, hung between them, not a weakness as traditional Ninian of philosophy might have classified it, but a strength born of adaptation. Survival on the frontier required flexibility, the willingness to incorporate new understandings, to evolve beyond the limitations of any single species perspective. Does that mean I won the betting pool? Dwight asked with a grin. That depends on the specific parameters established for victory, Ellison's replied, but her tone lacked its former rigidity. If the criterion was meaningful communication beyond professional necessity, then yes, victory conditions have been satisfied. And if the criterion was friendship, the question touched on concepts that Nanians and humans defined differently. Friendship to humans encompassed emotional connection, mutual support, shared experiences. To Nayans, the closest equivalent concept translated roughly as consistent alliance of mutual benefit, a more pragmatic understanding, but not entirely dissimilar in practical application. By Ninian standards, we have established a functional partnership that transcends immediate survival necessity, she acknowledged. By human standards, I believe the term friends would not be inaccurate. Dwight's smile widened. High praise indeed from a Nyan. I'll take it. Night descended on the academy. Most inhabitants slept, exhaustion finally claiming them after days of crisis management and recovery efforts. On the horizon, rebuilt sectors of the dome glimmered faintly, but a portion remained cracked, a reminder of vulnerability and resilience both. Ellison's walked through the silent corridors of the shelter, pausing near the laboratory where they had rescued Arlen. She placed her palm against the wall, leaving a faint blue imprint, a mark of survival, of presence, of connection. The gesture would have been meaningless on Nana, perhaps even considered irrational. Here it felt right, a declaration that transcended words, a testament to change. As a new day approached, Dwight prepared to join an orbital medical transport for advanced treatment of his injured hands. The procedure would require several days, after which he would return to assist with the academy restoration. He stood near the airlock, equipment packed in, ready for the shuttle's arrival. Footsteps behind him made him turn, and he found Ellison standing in the same spot where they had first met, her blue skin catching the early light that filtered through the temporary shelter's translucent ceiling. For a moment it seemed they had come full circle, yet everything had changed in ways neither could have anticipated. Will you return? She asked, her normally confident voice tinged with an unfamiliar note that might have been uncertainty. Yes, he replied without hesitation, but not as the person I was. He extended his bandaged hand toward her, a simple human gesture of connection. Ellison's hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it, blue fingers intertwining with tan ones. The touch bridged more than physical Distance, it connected worlds. Perspectives, futures, above them. Beyond the transparent sections of the shelter, the star that warmed Nia 3 began its ascent, bathing the damaged academy in golden light. Within the structure, systems hummed back to life, pulsing with energy that resembled nothing so much as a beating heart. And at the center of it all, two figures from different worlds stood connected. New kind of adaptation, a new form of survival, a testament to the resilience of life in all its diverse forms. If you like this story, click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular. Have a nice day.